Gittin Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, third order consequence, Im Yesh Onus Begittin. Firstly, the shiur is dedicated by Ilan Levi, who although isn't physically here every morning, listens to the shiur regularly in the memory of his late father, whose yortzeit it is today, Eliyahu ben Yeshayahu. And although I didn't know Mr. Levi, the description that Ilan gave me of him is just so very beautiful. Somebody who was not only generous from his heart in everything that he did, but really made a difference in influencing people to make good choices, to be good people, and had this capacity to deal with difficult issues without unraveling shalom, keeping peaceful relationships and yet being able to confront issues and deal with issues. So to be able to navigate the tension between emet and shalom, as we've often spoke about, seems to have been one of Mr. Levy's qualities, and we wish the family a long life and that their neshama has an aliyah. The sponsoring of a shiur, as I've often said, is an enormous chut for the person in whom one is sponsoring it, because of the hundreds of people who are listening to the shiur. And one insight from the shiur that causes a person to think differently, to operate differently, and all of that, who knows what impact that has, the chain effect that has. We're talking here of third order consequence. It's not only of decisions, but just of changes in one's life. All that domino effect can be attributed to the shiur, which has been sponsored in memory of a particular person, in this case of Eliyahu ben Yeshayahu. So we talked about third order consequence. Ray Dalio brought out a book in, I don't know, it was about 2011, 2012, called Principles. He was one of the most successful hedge fund managers in the world ever. And he wrote principles which are life principles, not just principles of investment. They're principles of investment as well, but they're also principles of life. And it's a book that's become very popular. And one of the things he talks about there is the failure of people to consider second and third order consequence when they make decisions. To understand not only what the result of the decision will be, but what is the result of the result and the result of the result of the result. And most of the mistakes we make in decision making is because we don't think through to second and third order consequence. And here we're dealing with the topic of onus. So it's beyond my control. I couldn't have anticipated. Something happened which I couldn't have anticipated. That's called onus. And onus rachmana patre. The Torah regards an action of onus, something you couldn't have anticipated, something beyond your control, and the different ways of viewing it. Either the Torah says it's as if it didn't happen. We just ignore it completely. Or it happened, but it's not attributed to you because you didn't do it deliberately. It was something beyond your control. How beyond your control does it need to be? Particularly when it comes to relationships, and here we're talking about gittin. Now a man gives a get with a t'nai, he makes a get with a certain condition, and due to circumstances beyond his control, he can't fulfill the condition. Now what happens? Where is his wife? And we will see from here that one has to be extra special careful, that onus is measured not only in terms of did something happen that was beyond your control. Onus is also, could you have predicted, should you have thought about the possibility? Should you have planned for the possibility? Thinking second and third order consequence, should you have taken that into account? Because that could be the pshia, that could be the carelessness, the fact that you stopped at first order and you didn't go to second and third order, particularly when we're talking about a woman. Now, we learned back in Ksubas Daf Gimel, we've got a Matmonim on that daf, we learned the origin of the din of Onus. It comes from the law of rape. And the girl has been raped, she's not punished in any way. It was beyond her control. That's we learn that midoraisa onus rachmana patre, that for an onus there is no punishment. It's not considered an action of the individual. However, by gittin, the Gemara says there, when it comes to matters of gittin, ein onus begittin. The Gemara there says you can't claim onus begittin. And when it comes to gittin, you can't say, I didn't think of the consequence. The Gemara there says it's because of the tznuim and the prutzim. The Gemara gives a reason. But we'll see in our sugya, it goes beyond that. It's because you're dealing with the sensitivities of a woman, of a wife. And you should think far more carefully about the consequences of what you do and say when you're dealing with a woman, and particularly when you're dealing with a wife, because there's super sensitivity in these particular areas. Let's have a look at the sugya. It starts off with a strange case. These are just strange scenarios. You can picture them in your mind. A man says, I'm going off on a trip. I don't want you to be left as an agunah if I don't come back. And you don't know if I'm alive or dead. So if I'm not back in 30 days, here's a get. The get takes effect. unless I'm back within 30 days. If I'm back within 30 days as planned, the get is cancelled and we go on as usual. If I don't come back within 30 days, probably something's happened to me and you're a divorcee, you're not an aguna. What happens is he comes back and the river's flooding and he can't get across the river. And there are people on the other side of the river. Maybe even his wife is there and he says, I'm back. She says, too late. Sorry, too late. I don't call that back. You're not here. He says, but the river's flooding. I would have been there. I just can't. She says, sorry, didn't you learn the Gemara in Ksubas Daf Gimel? Ein Onus begittin. Sorry, guy. Marriage is over. Thanks for the get. Have a happy life. And off she goes. And that's the din. It says Shmuel in our Gemara, Lo Shmei Matya. That's not called arriving back. Arriving at the airport but not getting home because there's traffic, your problem. You should have thought of that. It's not that you could have avoided the flood. No, you couldn't have avoided the flood. You should have thought of the possibility of delay. And you should have planned for the possibility of delay because you're dealing with a woman. You're dealing with your wife. And then the Gemara gives another case, which is what we focus on. A man says, they're having a fight, and she says, I want a divorce. I want out of this. He says, look, let's go to dinner. Let's talk this through. I'll write a get now. If I don't manage to bring you around, if I don't manage to talk this out and satisfy you, the get is here. But hopefully we'll sort it out and then the get is ignored. He then tries very hard to please her. He takes her to a beautiful restaurant and he talks to her and he gets her friends to talk to her and she doesn't want it. Has he done his bit or not? Can he say, look, I did what I can. I can't control her. She doesn't want the get. That's an onus. That's not my fault, my problem. And therefore, this is an onus, and the get still doesn't work. I still want more time. Or do we say, ein onus begittin? Sorry. So there are two lashonot in the Gemara as to what exactly Rav Yosef says. The one thing is Rav Yosef says, Mi ya'iv la'atarka v'didinar delo efaisa. How can he say, I've done everything I could to appease her? Did you give her a ton of money? You didn't give her a ton of money, so you haven't done everything you could yet. Or the other view is that Rav Yosef said, what do you expect, that he has to give her a ton of money? He's done whatever he could do. So the two views depend on whether we say there's onus by gittin or not. The Ramban explains that, the last source on the sheet, the Ramban explains that the question of whether ein onus by gittin or not is only in a middle case. In other words, if you didn't think of first order consequence, that's called an onus de shchiach. And that's definitely not an onus. That's a predictable onus. Yes, it's a little bit of onus, but you could have figured it out. And you didn't even think first order. That's definitely not an onus in gittin. On the other extreme, if it's you thought to third order consequence, and this is beyond that, there's no way you could have predicted it. That everybody agrees that is an onus, even by gittin. The whole argument is shchiach v'lo shchiach, like second order consequence. You could have thought it through and you didn't. Yes, it was a far-fetched possibility, but you could have thought it through. You're dealing with a woman's life. How could you not have thought it through, at least to second order of consequence? The whole issue in these two lashonot of Rav Yosef is where you could have thought it through, it's only second order consequence, and you didn't even get to second order consequence. The one lashon of Rav Yosef is, yeah, but you went as far as you can go, and you thought as far as you could be predicted to think. And the other one is, no, you haven't thought enough. And we'll see as we go into this and understand the sugi, we just see how the Gemara gets into this idea of how carefully do you need to think things through? How far do you need to try and predict consequences when you're dealing with the life of another human being? This is not just a business deal. And we have different scales on the spectrum. We have a beautiful Toras Gittin. The Toras Gittin was written by the Nesivos. The Nesivos HaMishpat is a terribly important parish on Choshen Mishpat, and we use it all the time. Nesivos was a colleague of the Tzos HaChoshen. They interact a lot, and we've got their interactions. He was at the time of the Chasam Sofer and Rabbi Kiva Eger. He interacted a lot with them. This is the end of the 18th century. That golden time of Torah learning and teaching. And he wrote Toras Gittin on Gittin, on Even Oezer and Gittin. And he comes to an interesting conclusion, and he says, based on Rashi, explaining Rashi, he comes out and says, Al kochach tzarich lomar, dezeh chashiv gamkin onesh shalai ala da'ato shitzarich liten lo mu'uma. This isn't even an onus. When he said that, he said, I wasn't thinking of paying her money. I thought I would take her out to dinner. We would spend a nice time together. I would get her friends to speak to her. And that would surely bring her around. It didn't enter my mind I would have to give her money. And now it emerges I'm supposed to give her money as well. I didn't expect that. Says the Toras Gittin, that's already an onus. and it's a question of whether the yesh onus begittin or ein onus begittin, but that's enough. In other words, he thought through to first order consequence and no further. But if you thought through to first order consequence, that's already onus, says the Torah Gittin in Rashi. Tosfos himself says differently. Tosfos says no, that had he paid her a ton of money and she didn't accept it, that would have been an onus. But if he didn't even think that I might have to pay her money, he didn't even go that far, that's not onus. So really the machlokas here between Rashi and Tosfos, as we are understanding it, is, do you define piyus? I said I would appease you. That was the condition. Here's a get. If I don't appease you, the get is kal. The get will work. How do you measure successful appeasement? By the effort I put in or by your acceptance? What did I mean when I said I'll appease you? Did I mean I'll do everything in my power to appease you? Or did I mean I'll get you to say yes? That's what I'll do. That's the machlekes. So Tosfos says, you've given her a lot of money. How much more could you have done? The Rashi says, even if you didn't give her the money, you try to get her with friends. That's sufficient. The Tosfos Harosh says, until she agrees, you haven't been mefayes her. You measure piyus, you measure appeasement by her acceptance, not by your effort. I tried. That's not an answer. You didn't succeed. You tried, but you didn't succeed. And you said you would be mefayes her. You didn't say, on condition, I take you out to dinner. On condition, I give you money. I give you a tanda. You didn't say that. You said, on condition, I appease you. You have not appeased her. She's not appeased. And he says, but I can't control her mind. Well, then you shouldn't have made that condition. So Tosfos Harosh holds him even more responsible. Again, you need to actually go into the sugya and learn these Rishonim carefully to fully appreciate the development of the sugya. But at this point, I just want you to appreciate how Chazal are dealing with how far are you expected to move into prediction of second order, third order consequence before you can claim it's onus. This was beyond my control. You've got to do some thinking. You can't just claim, I tried, I did my best. You've got to actually think of consequences. The Yamshel Shlomo, the Marshal is such an important person and underrated. We don't use him enough. The Marshal is during the period of the Mechaber and the Ramor, and as important as the Mechaber and the Ramor. And some say it even during his time, even greater than the Ramor. And he was in touch with the Ramor all the time. A lot of the halachas come from the Marshal. The Ramor himself often quotes the Marshal. And the Marshal wrote the Yamshel Shlomo, a perush on Shas, apart from his area of Psak. And he writes here, he explains why we have to be so careful when it comes to Gittin and Ein Onus Begittin. It's not just because of Tsunuim or Perushim, as we learnt in Ksubis. It goes further, and after he analyzes Rashi and Tosfos, and he says, Einzu milta delo ishchicha me'achashi kibel alav lefaisa v'hi eshet isha kshat ruach umarat le'evav im ken bish'at hatnai lo hayta ru'uya lefaisa. He should have known that my wife is a difficult person to please. He knows his wife. So you can't say this is onus. I didn't know I would have to pay her. You know she's not an easy person to please. Onus is when something new happens that you couldn't have predicted. Nothing new happens. Your wife is the same wife. She's not easy to please. And that's something that attracted you. That's why you married her. You have to work to please her. You knew that. So when you said, I will appease you, you knew that's going to be a challenge, that's going to be difficult. That's not noines. So you're dealing with relationships here. That's the nature of women. They might be very soft in nature, but when it gets into matters of divorce, it's a well-known fact that it's not that easy to appease them. Then they become adversaries. It's kenegdo, like an ezer kenegdo, very soft and nice when the relationship is good. But when you've broken the relationship, she becomes an adversary. She becomes kenegdo, and you know that. So if you knew that, you should have taken care of that. And that's why, as the Tosfos Harosh would say, even if you gave her a ton of money and she still wasn't mitpayeset, she still wasn't appeased, you still can't claim onus. I gave her $1 million. I gave her $5 million. Tough, but you didn't appease her. You said you would appease her, and you can't say, but I didn't know she wouldn't be appeased. You know your wife, and you should have figured that out. You should have thought that far forward. The Ramban goes along a similar line and says also, why is that held? Even if it's not a very likely honest, you've still got to think it through. Because that's the nature, because there's nothing so harsh as a bad woman, or a woman who's angry, or a woman who's alienated. You should have known that. You're not a child. You know that what's going on, and you should have predicted about how hard it's going to be. The Yam Shlomo, again, I've brought to you at the end of it, just summarizes all the halachot here, the difference between the three orders of consequence, shchiach, lo shchiach, and shchiach velo shchiach, where he explains it and explains the idea. But once again, as I've been saying every morning, please revisit the shiur even for 15 seconds during the day later on. Remember the idea that we have to think things through. Yes, onus rachmana patre, but onus is only when you've done your bit in thinking through. How far do you have to think through? Well, it depends. In business, you have to think through 1 degree consequence to be called an honest. If you want to do good business, you should think through to 2nd and 3rd degree consequences, Ray Dalio says. But for the purpose of honest, if you've thought through to 1 degree consequence, that's as far as you need to think. But when you're dealing with gittin, when you're dealing with breaking up a relationship, with wrecking another person's life, 1st order consequence is not enough. You've got to think of the consequence of what you're doing, the consequence of the consequence, and the consequence of the consequence of the consequence, and you've got to think forward and understand exactly what might happen and the degree to which you're responsible for what happens thereafter.